Welcome to Stories and Tea, Episode 3. Alright, Chapter 5. Though there were only a few more weeks left of school before the summer holidays began, each day seemed 100 years long. I could hear the river boiling over sandbars as I sat at my desk, and I could smell the sticky sweet smell of young poplar leaves. Our school stood right beside the river, and every now and then a flock of ducks would go over the playground quack, quack, quacking, as if they were laughing at us for being stuck inside, while they were flying free across the wide prairie. What made it even worse, for me, was just sitting there wondering what my owls were doing. After school, I would jump on my bike and pedal like 40 over the bridge and down our street. When I got close to home, I would give a couple owl whoops to let Wool and Weeps know that I was coming. By the time I skidded into the yard and parked my bike, they would be tramping impatiently up and down in their cage. As soon as the door was open, they would come waddling out as fast as they could, ready for play. Wool liked to scramble up on the back of an old lawn chair. Then he would take a wild leap and try to land on my shoulder. If he missed, he would nosedive into the lawn, but it never bothered him much. He would hop back to the chair, climb up, and try again, until he finally made it to my shoulder. Weeps was different. He never believed he could do anything by himself, so he would just sit on the lawn and whimper until I picked him up and put him on my other shoulder. I think Weeps' spirit must have been broken in the oil drum, because as long as I knew him, he was always afraid of doing things. With both owls riding on my shoulders, I used to go down the street to where our gang played games in an empty lot. Can the Can was a favorite game that spring. Sort of a combination of baseball and football. We used an inflated rubber beach ball that belonged to Murray, and when all the kids got chasing it, Wool would get so excited he would join in too. One time, he got in the way of the ball just when someone kicked it, and it knocked the wind clean out of him. The next time the ball came near him, he made a jump and got hold of it with both sets of claws. There was a hissing noise, and the ball went limp. Wool was pleased as punch, but we weren't, because it was the only ball that we had. All the kids except Bruce and Murray were a bit scared of the owls, so when I had them on my shoulders, I could go anywhere in Saskatoon and be safe as houses. Even the tough kids down by the flour mill kept their distance when I had the owls with me. Those owls were better bodyguards than tigers. Wool and Weeps grew fast. Weeps would eat anything he could get and still be hungry, but Wool was fussy about his food. At first, Wool would only eat cooked butcher's meat, hard-boiled eggs, and fig cookies. Later on, he would eat anything that came from our table, except for vegetables. Even vegetables. I beg your pardon. Even vegetables. All except parsnips, which he hated. Occasionally, both owls would eat a dead gopher that some kid had shot or snared as a present for them, but they didn't really like their supper raw. By the middle of June, when they were 3 months old, my new pets had reached full size. Wool was a little bigger than Weeps and stood about 2 feet high, but his wingspread was nearly 5 feet across. The claws of both were about an inch long and sharp as needles, and their big hooked beaks looked strong enough to open a tin can. Weeps was a normal owl color, sort of mottled brown, but Wool stayed almost pure white, with just a few black markings on his feathers. At night, he looked like a ghost. Although they were grown up now, neither of the owls seemed to know what his wings were for. Because they saw us walking around, they seemed to think they had to walk around too. Maybe if I'd been able to fly, they would have learned to fly a lot sooner, but the way things were, both owls tried to do what we kids did. They saw us climbing trees, so they took to climbing trees. It was pretty silly to watch Wool climbing. He used to really climb. First, he'd jump up to a low branch, and then he'd use his beak and his claws to half lift himself and half shinny to the next branch. My pigeons used to circle around sometimes and watch him. They must have thought that he was crazy. People sometimes thought so too. One day, Wool was climbing a poplar in our front yard when a man and woman stepped onto the sidewalk and watched him, with their mouths open. Finally, the man said to me, "What on earth's the matter with that bird? Why doesn't he fly to the top of the tree?" "Oh, he can't fly, sir," I replied. "He never learned how." The man looked at me as if I were crazy too, and walked off without another word. The day Wool actually learned to fly was one I'll remember for a long time. He had climbed a cottonwood in the backyard and had got out onto a thin little branch, and he couldn't get back. You never saw an owl look so unhappy. He was teetering up and down on the end of the branch and hoo-hoo-hooing at me to come and get him out of his fix. Dad and Mother came out to see what was going on, and they started to laugh, because who ever thought of a bird who couldn't get himself down out of a tree? But when people laughed at Wool, it hurt his feelings and upset him terribly. What with the laughter and the fact that it was supper time and he was hungry, Wool got a little careless. Finally, he teetered a little too far forward and lost his balance. "Hoo-hoo!" he shrieked as he bounced through the branches towards the ground. Then all of a sudden, he spread his wings, and the next thing any of us knew, he was flying. Well, sort of flying. Not having done it before, he didn't really know what he was doing, even then. You could tell he was just as surprised as we were. He came swooshing out of the tree like a rocket, and he seemed to be heading straight for me, but I ducked, and he pulled up and went shooting back into the air again. He was still hoo-hooing like mad when he stalled and slid back, downward, tail first, and hit the ground with an awful thump. By that time, I was laughing so hard I had to lie on the grass and hold my stomach, and when I looked up at last, it was to see Wool stomping into his cage. He was furious at all of us, and I couldn't persuade him to come out again until the next day. At supper that night, my father said, "You know, I don't believe that owl realizes he's an owl. I believe he thinks he's a human being. You'll have to educate him, Billy." It wasn't quite as bad as that. Wool eventually did learn to fly pretty well, but he never seemed to like flying, or trust it. He still preferred to walk wherever he was going. Weeps never learned to fly at all. I tried to teach him by throwing him off the garage roof, but he wouldn't even try. He would just close his eyes, give a hopeless kind of moan, and fall like a rock without even opening his wings. Weeps didn't believe he could fly, and that was that. Just before school ended, Wool learned a new trick, which bothered me a lot. He discovered that if he could take a good swipe at it with his claws, he could tear a hole in the kitchen wire of the cage. Once he learned to do this, it was impossible to keep him penned up when he didn't want to be. This worried me because there were a lot of tough alley cats, and tough dogs too in Saskatoon. I was afraid if one of them ever did get a hold of Weeps or Wool when I wasn't around, then that would be the end. After a look at the owl's claws and beaks, Mother said she thought it would be the end of any cat or dog that tackled Wool or Weeps, but I was still pretty worried. One night, Wool had a little argument with Mud about a bone, and Wool got mad and wouldn't come out of his tree to go into his cage at dusk. I called him and called him, but he just ignored me, and finally I had to go off to bed and leave him outside. I slept pretty lightly that night, with one ear cocked for trouble, because I knew that cats would be about. Sure enough, just at dawn, I heard a squawk and scuffling noise outside. I hopped out of bed, grabbed my air gun, and whipped out of the house as fast as I could. Wool wasn't in the tree. In fact, there was no sign of him anywhere in the front yard. I raced around the corner to the back, expecting to find him dead and eaten, but instead, I found him asleep on the back porch steps. He had his feathers ruffled out the way birds do when they're asleep, and it wasn't until I got right up to him that I saw the cat. Wool was sitting on it, and only its head and tail stuck out beneath his feathers, but enough was showing so that I could see this cat wasn't going to bother anyone anymore. I pulled Wool off, and he grumbled a little bit. I think he'd found that cats made good foot warmers. It was a big ginger tomcat that lived 2 doors down the street and belonged to a big man who did not like kids. This cat had been the terror of every other bird, cat, and even of the dogs in our neighborhood for years. I got a shovel and buried it at the bottom of the garden. I suppose the cat had thought Wool was some new kind of chicken. Well, he found out differently. Dogs were no problem to my owls either. Though Mutt was no owl lover himself, he wouldn't let any strange dog chase them, not without a fight at least. Several times he saved Weeps from a mauling, but he didn't need to look after Wool. There was a German shepherd who lived near us, and one day this dog met Wool out walking, and decided to see how a horned owl tastes. I heard a ruckus and came running, but by the time I got to the street, Wool was sitting on the dog's back, digging in his claws for all he was worth, and ripping chunks out of the dog's ears with his beak. The shepherd headed down Spadina Avenue, yipping till you could have heard it in Timbuktu. Wool rode him for 3 blocks, and might have ridden him right out of town if the dog hadn't dodged through a hole in a board fence and knocked Wool off. I chased after them on my bike, but by the time I got to the fence, Wool had picked himself up, given himself a shake or two, and settled his feathers, and was his usual friendly self. He gave a little cheerful hoo-hoo, and jumped up on the handlebars for a ride home. Word seemed to get around after that, and the neighborhood dogs took to crossing over to the other side of the road when they saw Wool coming. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. Oh, it's this chapter. Oh no. Okay. On the day school closed for the summer, the T. Eaton department store announced it was going to sponsor a pet parade 2 weeks later, and there were going to be prizes for the most interesting pets and best displays. Bruce was the first of our gang to hear about it, and he came right over to my house to tell Murray and me. "Hey," said Bruce, after he told us all he knew, "with the animals we've got, we could win a dozen prizes. What about it?" Murray and I didn't need much convincing. We spent the next couple of days planning what we'd do. First, we decided to hitch Mutt and Rex to my old express wagon. We would fix it up with colored cardboard and stuff so it looked like a circus wagon. We planned to put an old fur muff of my mother's around Mutt's neck to make him look like a lion, and then we were going to paint black zebra stripes on Rex. Then we decided to build a circus cage on the wagon and fill it with different kinds of gophers. And finally, we decided to have the owls riding on top of the cage all dressed up in doll's clothes. We had 2 weeks to get things ready, and we really worked. First, we built the circus cage, and when we were finished, it looked just like the real ones that used to come to Saskatoon with Bailey Brothers Circus every summer. Ours wasn't as strong, though, because the sides were only cardboard, painted red and blue and yellow. And instead of iron bars, we used chicken wire to keep the gophers from getting out. When it was finished, we made a hike out to the bluffs near the exhibition grounds, because that was a good place to find wood gophers. We got 6 of them, and on the way home we snared about a dozen striped gophers that were living in a cut bank by the roadside. Together with the 30 ordinary gophers we already had, this added up to an awful lot of gophers, and there wasn't going to be room for all of them in just one circus cage. Murray fixed that. "Why don't we make another cage out of my wagon?" he suggested. "Then we'd have twice as much chance to win first prize." It was a dandy idea, so we went ahead and built the second cage. Then we decided to put some of our white rats in with the extra gophers in the second one, just to make it different. The day before the parade, which was on a Saturday, we had everything ready. I had borrowed some doll clothes from Faith Honnigan, who lived on the next block. Murray had got some washable sign paint from his dad so he could paint the black stripes on Rex. We had found a set of real dog harnesses for Mutt, and we made a second set for Rex out of twine. The cage wagons were all finished and stored away in our garage so they wouldn't get wet if it happened to rain. On Sunday morning, I didn't even wait to eat my breakfast before I rushed out to the garage. Murray was already there, but Bruce didn't come along for about an hour, and we were getting worried he might not make it at all. By the time he showed up, we had the gophers and the white rats all loaded, and I was trying to get the dolls' clothes on the owls. Bruce came into the yard with a shoebox under his arm and a big grin on his face. "Hi!" he shouted. "I guess we'll win first prize for sure. Bet you can't guess what I have in this box." Murray and I couldn't guess. I shook the box a couple of times, and whatever was inside was pretty heavy. I was just going to untie the string and open it when Bruce grabbed it away from me. "No, sir," he said. "Don't you do that. We might never catch this critter again." "Oh, come on," I begged him. "What do you got in there anyway? Come on, Brucey. You have to tell us." "Don't have to, don't aim to," Bruce said. "Just wait and see." Murray and I pretended we didn't care what he had in his shoebox anyway. I went back to putting the dolls' clothes on the owls, and it wasn't easy. Weeps just stood there and whimpered while I pulled a pink dress over his head and pinned a floppy hat on him. But Wool took one look at the sailor suit I had for him and rumpled himself into a ball and began to clack his beak at me and hiss. It took 2 of us to hold him down while we got him dressed. By the time we were finished, he was in a terrible temper. We couldn't trust him to stay quietly on the wagon top after all that fuss, so we decided to tie him to it with some twine around his legs. That made him madder still. While Bruce and I were working on the owls, Murray was trying to paint the stripes on Rex. Rex didn't like it, and there was about as much black paint on Murray as on the dog. Then Murray said he might as well finish what Rex had started, so he smeared black paint all over his own face and said he would just go to the parade as a Zulu warrior. Just before we were ready to start for downtown, Bruce took the paintbrush and printed some words on the shoebox. Then he tied the box to the top of the second wagon. What he printed was, "Surprise pet, do not feed." All of it spelled wrong, by the way. We harnessed up the dogs, with Matt leading, because he knew how to pull in the harness, and Rex didn't. Rex didn't seem to want to learn either. He kept pulling off to one side, and every time he did it, he almost upset the wagons. We had an awful time getting our outfit all the way to downtown, and we were nearly late for the parade, which had started at 10 o'clock. One thing, though, by the time we did get there, old Rex was just about worn out, and he had stopped acting like a bucking bronco. The parade formed in front of the Carnegie Public Library, and then it was supposed to go about 6 blocks to the T. Eaton store where the judges' stand was. It seemed like 1,000,000 kids were there, with every kind of pet you ever saw. One little boy, about 5 years old, was leading a Clydesdale horse as big as an elephant, and the horse had "baby" on the blanket it was wearing. If that thing was a baby, I wouldn't know it. There were lots of goats, and it was a hot day, and you could smell the goats all over Saskatoon. Some of the girls were wheeling cats along in baby carriages, and the cats were wearing silly hats and were pinned down under lacy covers. Some of them were yowling fit to scare the dead. There were more dogs than you could shake a stick at, and every kind of dog you ever heard about, and a lot of kinds that nobody ever heard about. Right in the middle of the parade was a boy leading a pet skunk on a string. He had the middle of the parade all to himself, too. Nobody was crowding around him. There were pet rabbits, ducks, chickens, geese, a couple of pigs, and a bunch of pedigree calves. There was even one little boy carrying a quart jar full of water with a bunch of tadpoles swimming around in it. You'd expect lots of trouble, what with the animals and the fact it was a hot day and everything, and everybody was excited, and there was so much noise. But there really wasn't too much trouble. There were dog fights, of course, and one dog who wasn't even in the parade at all made a go for a cat in a baby's carriage, and it ended up getting stampeded by the goats. But some of the salesmen from the store were in the parade too, and they got things quieted down, though one of them did get bitten on the leg a little bit. It took about an hour for our outfit to get opposite the judges' stand. There were 5 judges, some women and some men. The mayor of Saskatoon was one of them. There were 2 Mounties beside the stand, dressed in their red coats. Mounties are Canadian police, by the way, and they were red, not blue. A lot of parents were jammed up against the stand too, so they could cheer if their kids won a prize. I'd had a good look at the parade by then, and there wasn't a group to match ours. We were sure to win a good prize, and I figured it would be the first prize. We had a little trouble though when we got to the stand because Rex was so tired he just lay down and he wouldn't get up again. But that only made the judges laugh, and they came down from the stand to get a good look at our entry. I overheard one of the women judges telling another woman that ours was the best rig she had seen, and isn't it cute the way it's decked out just like a real circus? The first prize seemed to be right in our pockets when the president of T. Eaton Store, who was also one of the judges, saw the shoebox on top of the second wagon. "Hello," he said. "Now here's a good idea. Look at this, Sam. These boys have a special pet in reserve. Now that's what I call smart merchandising." Well, of course, everyone crowded around to see what the special pet was, and Bruce, with a silly smile on his dopey face, untied the box and lifted up the lid. Inside the box was... We'll find out next time.